Halloween in our household had always been one of joyful preparation. Paper bats and jack-o'-lanterns adorned the porch, and every year, my wife Ella and I made an event of setting up a small haunted house in our yard for the neighborhood kids. This year was different. We'd just moved into the quaint, historic town of Ashwick, and while the charm of the place was undeniable, an odd atmosphere lingered as soon as we arrived. It wasn't anything overt, just a sense of eerie silence that blanketed the streets at night, as if the town held its breath when the sun went down. Our house was an old Victorian, with stained glass windows and spindly woodwork that seemed almost too intricate, as though each carved detail held secrets. The realtor had described it as a piece of Ashwick history, though she'd been quick to add that the house was just as sturdy as it was old. When we'd first walked through it, I'd felt a strange chill down my spine, a fleeting sensation which I'd dismissed as nothing more than the effect of an overactive imagination. Ella, however, had looked enchanted, envisioning the Halloween decorations and seasonal events we'd host, already envisioning it as our perfect forever home. As we settled in, Ella and I did our best to make the place feel like our own. We painted walls, rearranged furniture, and took late-night strolls around the neighborhood to familiarize ourselves with the community. The people in Ashwick were friendly, but reserved, as if there was something they held close, some story they didn't share with newcomers. In particular, a certain caution would flicker in their eyes when Halloween came up, and I noticed that while decorations popped up on many doorsteps, they were subdued compared to what we were used to. We chalked it up to Ashwick being a quieter, more traditional town, but one incident lingered with me. During a casual conversation with our neighbor, a woman in her 60s with a serious expression, she leaned close and whispered, "Watch out for the midnight knocker." I laughed, assuming it was a local legend or some old wives' tale meant to give newcomers a scare. She didn't laugh with me. Instead, her eyes took on a grave look, and she added, "Just follow the rules. It's been a tradition here for centuries." Later that night, over dinner, I mentioned the midnight knocker to Ella. She shivered, feigning fright, then giggled, dismissing it as another ghost story. "These small towns always have legends, right?" she'd said with a smile, taking my hand. "That's part of the charm." But when Halloween night arrived, charm was the last thing on my mind. That strange unease clung to me as I finished setting up decorations outside. A handful of kids had already come by, giggling as they took candy from our haunted candy bowl, and their laughter helped dissipate the tension. For a while, it felt just like any other Halloween. That is, until we started hearing the whispers from passers-by about the midnight knocker and his sinister rules. Around 8 in the evening, as I refilled the candy bowl, I noticed a note tucked into our screen door. Its ink was faded and scrawled in a script that looked centuries old. There was no signature, just a single sentence underlined 3 times. "Follow the rules or he'll come for you." I showed it to Ella, and she laughed it off as some neighborhood prank. But I noticed her laugh was forced, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door as if she were expecting someone, or something. The hours ticked by, and with each one, the streets outside grew quieter. By 11, not a single sound drifted in from outside. I closed the door and locked it, half laughing at myself for being so paranoid. It was just a story, after all. A local legend to add a little spice to Halloween night. But despite my reassurances, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, feeling like someone was watching from the shadows. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the knocking began. The knock was soft at first, almost gentle, like a polite request for entry. For a split second, I felt an absurd sense of relief, thinking it was a late-night trick-or-treater. But that relief turned to dread as I remembered the warnings about the midnight knocker. My heart thudded as I exchanged a glance with Ella, who was sitting rigid on the couch, her eyes wide and her hands gripping the fabric of her shirt. "Maybe it's just a prank," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. I felt my mouth go dry, but I tried to brush it off. "I'll just ignore it," I replied, forcing a nonchalance I didn't feel. Yet, every instinct I had screamed at me not to go near the door. Another knock echoed through the hallway, louder this time, each beat resonating in my chest. Ella's grip on my arm tightened, and her eyes darted to the note still lying on the coffee table. The one that listed the rules, unheeded and untouched. Despite my initial skepticism, I felt compelled to at least look at the list, to see what it had instructed us to do. I picked up the note with shaking fingers, scanning the rules as though my life depended on it. 1. Never open the door or look through the peephole. 2. Leave a candy wrapped in black cloth on the porch. 3. Keep your eyes down if you see his shadow pass. 4. Light 3 black candles until dawn. The simplicity of each rule struck me as terrifyingly clear, as though whoever wrote them had done so after countless trials and errors. Ella's gaze was fixed on the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her shoulders hunched like a trapped animal. Did you leave candy on the porch?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hadn't. We'd left out a large bowl of candy for the neighborhood kids, but there was no black cloth, no carefully wrapped offering to appease some mythical spirit. Another knock, harder this time, and so close to the door it sounded like the wood itself was straining under the force. My hand instinctively reached out, but Ella grabbed it, pulling me back. Don't go near the door," she hissed. I swallowed hard, nodding as if I'd been on the verge of a fatal mistake. The knocks continued, a relentless rhythmic sound that seemed to grow louder with each beat. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, through my bones. I wanted to bolt out the back door, to run as far away as possible from this cursed house, but every instinct warned me that leaving was even more dangerous. So we waited, huddled in tense silence, staring at each other, the air heavy with dread. Then came the first real sign that something was horribly, horribly wrong. A shadow, long and spindly, crept across the wall opposite us. I felt Ella's nails dig into my arm, and I barely dared to breathe as the shadow moved, dragging itself with agonizing slowness across the wall. It was misshapen, unnatural, and my mind struggled to make sense of it, as though my brain was rejecting what it saw. I didn't dare look at it directly. Instead, I kept my eyes down, clinging to the words in the note like a lifeline. "Keep your eyes down if you see his shadow pass." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as I forced myself to focus on the floor, counting each heartbeat as I waited for the shadow to disappear. But the shadow didn't disappear. It grew closer, inch by inch, until it loomed over us, dark and ominous. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, and I knew, somehow, in the depths of my soul, that if I looked up, I would see something that would change me forever, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Just don't look," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. I clung to her words, staring at the floor, praying for the shadow to pass. But then, as if mocking us, the knocking resumed, louder and more insistent. Each knock a violent jolt that rattled the walls. "We didn't leave the candy," Ella whispered. What if it's mad?" Her words struck me like a blow. I had dismissed the old traditions, scoffing at the idea of some ghostly trick-or-treater, and now we were trapped, taunted by something that shouldn't exist. The knocking grew more frenzied, each blow reverberating through the house, each one more aggressive, as though it could sense our fear and was feeding on it. Suddenly, the candles on the mantel flickered, their flames shrinking until they were barely embers. The room darkened, and in the dim light, I saw handprints begin to form on the walls. They were faint at first, but as the knocking grew louder, the handprints darkened, deepening into bruises against the wallpaper. I reached out, almost in a trance, to touch one of the marks, but Ella slapped my hand away, her face a mask of horror. "Don't touch it," she cried, her voice breaking. What if it's a mark? A curse?" Panic clawed at my throat as I realized she might be right. The knocks turned into furious pounding, the door shuddering with each blow. We huddled together, feeling the walls close in, the oppressive presence suffocating us. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe around us, taking on grotesque shapes that I couldn't begin to comprehend. It was as though the house itself was coming alive, each creak and groan amplified until it felt like we were trapped inside a living nightmare. Ella's hand tightened around mine, her nails digging into my skin as she whispered, "The candles. We need to light the candles." We scrambled to the mantel, our movements frantic as we grabbed the 3 black candles we'd bought for decoration. Ella's hand shook so badly that she could barely hold the lighter, and it took her several attempts before the first candle flickered to life. I watched the flame, praying it would hold, that it would ward off whatever horror was lurking just beyond the door. But even as the candles burned, the knocking continued, relentless and insistent, a pounding that seemed to resonate in my very soul. And then, with a sickening realization, I understood. Lighting the candles was only a temporary solution. The midnight knocker wouldn't stop until he'd had his due, until the rules were obeyed. I reached for the note again, my mind racing as I scanned the final instruction. Light the candles until dawn. But dawn was hours away, and the knocker's patience was clearly wearing thin. The shadows grew thicker, swirling around us like a storm, and I could feel an icy chill creeping up my spine. A sense that we were being watched by something far older and far darker than anything I could comprehend. The handprints on the walls seemed to pulse, their outlines bleeding into the wallpaper, and I knew with a sickening certainty that each mark was a warning, a reminder of what waited for us if we didn't obey. "We can't just sit here," Ella whispered, her face pale and drawn. "We have to do something." But there was nothing we could do. The knocker was here, and he wouldn't leave until his demands were met. We had broken the rules, and now we were paying the price. And as the final knock echoed through the house, I knew that whatever waited beyond that door was something far worse than any legend. Something that would haunt us forever if we didn't find a way to survive the night. The silence after that final knock was more terrifying than the noise itself. It was as though the house had been drained of sound, the air thick and stifling, every nerve in my body taut and tingling. We clutched the black candles, their flickering flames our only source of light, but even they seemed feeble, as though they were struggling against some unseen force. I turned to Ella, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. "We're going to get through this," I said, but my words felt hollow. We both knew that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Suddenly, a scraping sound echoed from the door, a slow, deliberate scratching, as though claws were dragging down the wood. Ella whimpered, and I reached out to steady her, feeling her body tremble against mine. "Stay back," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the scratching. But even as I spoke, I felt a dark pull toward the door, an inexplicable urge to look through the peephole. A voice in the back of my mind urged me to resist, to remember the rules, but the temptation gnawed at me, a compulsion that grew stronger with every second. I found myself moving forward, my steps slow and uncertain, as though some invisible force was guiding me. "Don't," Ella pleaded, grabbing my arm. Her grip was desperate, her nails digging into my skin. "Remember the rules. Don't look." But her words barely registered. My hand was already reaching for the door, my fingers curling around the cold metal of the doorknob. I knew I shouldn't, that whatever lay on the other side was beyond anything I could understand, but something inside me had to know. I needed to see. Slowly, I lowered my face to the peephole, squinting as I peered through the tiny glass window. At first, all I could see was darkness, a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to pulse and writhe as though it were alive. Then, slowly, a face began to materialize, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare brought to life. The face was hollow, with sunken eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. They were empty, devoid of anything human, but filled with an anger that radiated through the glass, searing into my mind. I felt a surge of terror, an overwhelming sense that I had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late. The face held me captive, its hollow gaze burrowing into my soul, branding me with a mark I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, my vision swimming as the image of that face burned itself into my memory. Ella was shouting something, her voice a distant echo, but I couldn't make out her words. My thoughts were consumed by that face, that hollow, empty gaze that had reached into me and claimed something I couldn't name. The knocks resumed, louder and more furious than before, shaking the entire house. I could feel the walls vibrating, could hear the glass in the windows rattling, as though it would shatter at any moment. And then, as the final knock echoed through the house, the door burst open. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles, plunging us into darkness. I could feel the presence of something in the room with us, something ancient and malevolent, its anger filling the air like a storm. I heard Ella scream, felt her hand slip from mine as she was pulled into the shadows, her voice fading as she disappeared. I lunged forward, reaching blindly into the darkness, desperate to pull her back, but my hands grasped nothing but air. The shadows seemed to close in around me, suffocating me, pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of that hollow gaze bearing down on me, the mark it had left on me pulsing like a wound. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The shadows receded, the pressure lifting as light returned to the room. I blinked, disoriented, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The door was closed, the candles were relit, and the room was empty. Empty, except for a single, bloody handprint on the wall. A handprint that matched the shape of Ella's. I staggered back, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. I couldn't comprehend what I had seen, couldn't make sense of the nightmare that had just unfolded. All I knew was that Ella was gone, taken by something beyond my understanding. Something that had marked me in ways I couldn't see, but could feel deep within my soul. And as I stared at that bloody handprint, a single, terrifying thought crossed my mind. The midnight knocker had claimed his due, and I was the one left to bear the curse. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by my shallow breaths as I stumbled back, staring at the handprint on the wall. It glistened darkly, a fresh stain of crimson against the pale wallpaper, the shape unmistakably Ella's. I wanted to scream, to tear at the walls and demand that whatever had taken her return her to me. But I knew it was pointless. The midnight knocker had made his choice, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. The hours until dawn crawled by in a fog of shock and horror. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think, only sat in the living room, watching the shadows dance across the walls, half expecting to see that hollow face lurking in the darkness. The black candles flickered on the mantel, their flame steady now, as if the ritual was finally complete. When the first light of dawn spilled through the windows, the weight lifted, and the house seemed to breathe again, as though it were finally free of some terrible burden. But I was far from free. Every corner of the house, every creak of the floorboards, held memories of that night, of Ella's scream, of the handprint on the wall. I couldn't bring myself to erase it, to wipe away the only trace of her that remained. The townspeople were sympathetic when I told them she had gone missing. They offered condolences, brought casseroles, whispered words of comfort. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew. They knew what had happened, and none of them dared to ask for details. They merely nodded with understanding, as though I'd joined some unspoken club, a circle of survivors bound by the curse of the midnight knocker. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move on, to piece my life back together. But I was haunted by that hollow gaze, by the mark it had left on me. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear faint knocking sounds echoing through the house, a reminder of the horror that had taken my wife and left me marked. I tried to leave Ashwick, but each time I packed my bags, something held me back. A sense of dread that grew stronger the farther I got from the house, as though the curse had rooted itself within me. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I was bound to the place, just as the midnight knocker was bound to his rules. I was part of his story now, a link in the chain of horror that stretched back through generations, and no amount of distance could break it. Now, as Halloween approaches again, I feel the familiar dread settling over me. The children still come by for candy, their laughter echoing down the street. Unaware of the shadow that hangs over this town, I leave the black cloth-wrapped candy on the porch every night, hoping that it will be enough, that the midnight knocker will be satisfied with his offering. But deep down, I know the truth. One night, he will return, and this time, there will be no warning, no rules to follow. He has claimed his due, and I am left to bear the curse, a prisoner of a horror I can never escape.